Hi, it's Chris Leach here from Decisive Wargame Design, and today I want to address a question that I often get about people interested in the Control to Catastrophe rules, both Caesar and Maximilian, and that is, what do the rules mandate in terms of unit size, in terms of number of figures or number of stands? And I suppose I wanted to make this short video just to assure you that it's entirely up to you. The rules don't mandate any representational size of unit. It has a number of unit sizes, and you are certainly encouraged to represent those units in a way that's evocative of whether it's a shallow unit, just, and I might do that with just 2 stands, 1 base depth. Perhaps it's a medium-sized unit, and maybe I'll do that with, again, 2 stands depth. Or if it's a deep unit, as is the case here, I might represent that with 3 stands depth. But this is entirely up to you. The game doesn't demand any number of figures or stands at all. And in fact, one of the pleasures of collecting armies for a gridded game is that it opens up both the aesthetic and, shall we say, practical options to you in terms of how many figures and stands that you want to use to represent your units. It's entirely up to you. What is important, however, is that you select a relationship between your standard unit size. So perhaps you have an existing collection that you want to try these rules with, and you have an existing collection. Well, you simply have to select a gridded playing surface that can accommodate the unit sizes that you already have. And probably the most important aspect of this is the unit frontage. Of course, that frontage has to fit within the confines of the grid box. Depth is a little less important, but as I say, the depth of a unit, which is the variable in terms of unit size in game terms, that can be suggested in a number of ways, but the frontage obviously has to fit into the grid box particularly. And as I say, how you represent a unit and what grid box size you use is entirely up to you, and should, of course, suit either an existing collection, an aesthetic preference, or perhaps is just a budgetary matter, or in terms of the speed with which you want to set up a game. What you've got in front of you here are 3 versions of exactly the same unit in game terms. This is a Landsknecht pike block. It's the largest unit in the game in so much that it is a deep unit. Again, frontages are always the same in the game because of the grid. This is a deep pike block. And I think actually the way it's modeled here in the middle really screams that this is a very large unit. And by most people's standards, not all, but for most people, this would represent a fair commitment to collect an army that has units with this number of figures. So this is about 66, I think, figures, something like that. And for a single unit, that's obviously quite a lot of effort and money in order to collect that. But it does look great. And of course, in order to accommodate this, this is my largest grid, my largest cloth in terms of the grid size. And of course, having lots of these units running around the table really does look good. This particular grid, these are 28 millimeter figures, and this grid is about 20 centimeters square, approximately 8 inches. And this is, as I say, accommodates this very large unit. And of course, it accommodates all these smaller units as well. Now, if I want to play with smaller units, but perhaps a larger battle with more units, I might opt to go for this particular size of unit, representing exactly the same thing in game terms. So here we have the same pike block, but represented on a smaller square, a smaller box on the grid. Now, on the same table surface, so I have a 6 by 12 foot table, which accommodates very comfortably the 9 by 18 recommended grid. But if I go to the smaller grid, this one's about 6 inches square, I of course get a grid that's 12 by 24. That's a lot more space, a lot more units that I can put on the battlefield. So for a larger game, I might use smaller units, understanding that functionally in game terms, they operate exactly the same. Now, if I want to quickly play test something, maybe a new scenario, and certainly in the process of playtesting the rules, we did this quite often, I could use my smallest grid. This grid goes onto my 6 by 4 foot table, and of course, the unit is now represented on these 80 millimeter or 8 centimeter squares by a single stand. But once again, this tiny little stand of 9 figures represents exactly the same unit functionally in game terms as this behemoth here. So the beauty of the gridded approach to gaming is that it opens up a number of possibilities. First, you can use an existing collection and just simply choose a grid that suits it. Secondly, you can, of course, choose a gridded surface and a unit composition that suits your aesthetic preferences. And finally, of course, if you're starting a collection from the ground up, you might want to start with a small grid. As you build your collection, you can maybe graduate to these larger sized grids or grid boxes. And so it allows you to get into the game very quickly. You can imagine that if you're building, for example, this Renaissance army, of French army of the early Italian wars or something, you could start by just simply painting a few of these complicated Landsknecht and start playing. And then as you build your collection, you can start building larger units and off you go. So I think there's a number of advantages of gridded play. And the nice thing is that they all, as I say, function exactly the same in game terms. One thing I do want to stress, however, is that you don't want your units to be too small in a large grid. And one of the reasons for that is that the gaps between your units can start looking a little too great. If, for example, we decided, okay, this is going to be a pike block for my particular collection, if I have a grid that is too large relative to the size of the unit, you can see that you start getting these large gaps. And that's something you want to avoid because, frankly, aesthetically, I don't think that looks right. Armies tended to deploy, whether it's an ancient army or indeed into the Renaissance, armies tended to deploy in a fairly contiguous fashion, and these large gaps, intuitively, would be dangerous for any army to deploy with these openings in their line. So again, make sure that you choose a gridded playing surface that I think suits, again, the models and unit organizations that you either have or prefer or need to collect in your particular circumstance. So thanks very much. Until next time.